The Kestrel line runs 11 kilometers along the old front, and in 3 years I had personally walked every meter of it more times than I could count, and I still hadn't finished clearing it. That is not a confession of failure. That is the job done right. A man who tells you he cleared 11 kilometers of contested ground in 3 years is a man who is lying to you or about to get somebody killed, and I had buried enough friends in the first profession to have no interest in auditioning for the second. I had come to that discipline the hard way, which is the only way it sticks. Before the armistice, I had been a combat engineer attached to a forward clearance unit, and in the last bad year of the partition war, I had watched a captain under time pressure certify a stretch of supply road as clear because command needed it clear by a certain hour, not because it was. 14 men rode a transport over that road 2 days later. I had not been the one who signed the certification, and I had told myself for a long time that this meant it wasn't mine to carry, and eventually I had stopped believing myself. When the war ended, I did not go home to whatever home might have still existed for me. I took a civilian clearance contract on the worst, slowest, least profitable stretch of front line the Reach Authority had on its books, and I made myself a simple rule that I have never once broken since. I sign nothing I have not personally verified with my own hands, no matter what it costs me in time or money or the authorities' patience. It is not a virtue. It is closer to a debt I pay down one certified meter at a time, and I did not expect, when I started paying it, that the debt would ever ask anything of me but patience. I lived at Murren's Crossing, which was not a town, not even a hamlet, just a lockhouse the Reach Authority had condemned, and I had uncondemned by moving into it, at the point where the old river ford met the old military road. From my window I could see the whole eastern shoulder of the line, the flagged lanes in their neat rows, orange for cleared, white for probed and holding, black for don't you dare, running down toward the resettlement roofs of Aldwych Reach 2 kilometers south. The authority paid me by the certified meter and left me alone otherwise, which suited both of us. I had come out of the partition war with a very particular set of habits, the kind that make you difficult at a dinner table and useful at exactly one thing, and the one thing was this: reading ground, knowing what was under it, refusing, on pain of losing the contract entirely, to certify soil I had not personally put a probe and a scanner and my own bad knees into. It was a Tuesday in late autumn, cold enough that the grass held frost past noon, when the girl came out of the tree line running like something was going to eat her. I was 300 meters out on the eastern shoulder, on my knees over a suspect reading that turned out to be nothing, an old fence post stub with enough ferrous content to spike the coil, when I heard it, not a shout, not words, just the particular flat slap of bare feet moving faster than any child's legs should be able to carry them, and I came up off my knees already knowing 2 things. 1, that sound was coming from the unflagged ground north of the last white lane, ground I had probed exactly 40 meters into and no further. 2, whoever was running in a straight line, which on that ground was the single most dangerous thing a person could do. She was small, I want to say that plainly and get it out of the way, because everything else about that day sits on top of it. Small, and moving flat out, arms pumping, dark hair or what I took for hair streaming back from a face I couldn't read yet at that distance. I did not have time to be careful about my own footing, and I was careful about it anyway, because carelessness on the Kestrel line doesn't just cost you, it costs whoever's counting on you to still be alive in the next 5 minutes. I went for the closest flagged lane, orange, certified, and I ran it flat out, screaming her direction to stop, to freeze, using every word for stop I knew in 3 languages, because I had no idea what she spoke and no time to find out. She didn't stop. She was 12 meters from the black flags, from ground I knew for a fact still held 2 seeker charges from a survey I'd done in the spring and deliberately not touched, because the extraction crew hadn't been scheduled yet, and disturbed seekers are worse than undisturbed ones. When I got close enough that my voice finally landed on her the way a hand would have, and she flinched sideways, stumbling, and went down hard on the frosted grass 8 meters short of the black line. I did not walk to her. I do not think anyone who has spent 3 years learning the difference between orange and black ground walks anywhere near either of those numbers. I got down, and I came to her low and slow along a bearing I already had memorized, calling out the whole way in a voice I kept level by main force, telling her not to move, not 1 inch, just stay down, stay still, I was coming. She had oversized eyes, gold going amber at the rims, and they fixed on me with an expression I would spend the next several weeks learning to read as terror held very carefully in check. The kind of terror a person learns when panic has gotten someone killed before. Her skin was a pale, mossy green, and along her cheekbones and the backs of her small hands there were freckling clusters of something that were not quite freckles, because as I got close I saw them pulse, a faint bloom of light, there and gone in time with her breathing. Pointed ears, no shoes, a tear in the shoulder of a garment that had been someone's coat once, cut down. "Don't move," I said again, closer now, close enough to see her chest heaving. "You're safe where you're sitting, just stay exactly there." She didn't understand my words, I know that now. What she understood was tone, and posture, and the fact that I had gotten down on the ground the same height as her instead of looming, and she went still the way a bird goes still, not calm, just conserving everything she had left for whatever came next. That was when I heard the second sound, worse than the first, a woman's voice, raw with running, calling a name that wasn't a word I knew, and behind it the particular ragged rhythm of someone who has been running for a very long time and has nothing left to run on. I got the girl. I would learn her name inside the hour, Sella, and I would spend 3 years afterward unable to hear that word without something in my chest going quiet. I got her up under one arm, checked our exact bearing back to the orange lane twice, because twice is the minimum on that ground, and half carried her clear while she made no sound at all, none, not one whimper, which frightened me more than crying would have. Her mother came through the tree line 40 meters south a moment later and simply fell. Not fainted, fell the way a person falls when the only thing that had been holding them upright was the need to reach a specific point, and the point had been reached, and the body had no further instructions. I left Sella sitting hard in the frosted grass on cleared ground, told her stay, with my palm flat and low the way you'd signal a dog you trusted, and I ran the lane south. The woman was Dorothy like the girl, older, exhaustion and something worse carved into her face, a long tear down one forearm gone black-green with dried blood, and when I got my hands under her shoulders to lift her, she fought me for 1/2 second with what strength she had left before her eyes found mine, and something in her went slack with a relief so total it looked almost like grief. "Human," she said, just that in accented but real trade cant the first language we'd share. "Human, please, my daughter." "She's fine, she's clear, I've got her." I got the woman's good arm over my shoulders. She weighed nothing, which told me things about how long they'd been running that I didn't like. "Can you walk?" "I have to." She said it like a fact of physics, not a boast, and she walked, dragging one leg, all the way down the certified lane to the lockhouse, with her daughter's small hand fisted into the back of my coat the whole way because Sella would not release her grip on me even to hold her mother's hand instead. And I understood later that this was the moment the choosing happened, though none of us said so yet. I got them both inside, got the woman onto the cot, got a blanket around the girl though she shivered anyway, and I did what field medicine I still remembered from a different uniform on that forearm, and it was clean work, not deep, but 3 or 4 days old and badly needing it. The woman's name was Aviath Kaur. She told me that first, before almost anything else, the way a person gives you their name when they intend for you to use it in a report or a eulogy, and are past caring which. "They will come here," she said, while I worked. "You should know that before you decide to help us further than you already have." "Who's they?" "Vantor Remnant." She said it like the words tasted of something. Old war men who did not stop being soldiers when the war stopped needing them. I mapped their transit routes for 6 years, cartography, survey work. I did not know at first what the routes were for. Her jaw worked. Children, marked at birth in the debt registries during the occupation years, never cleared, never forgiven, sold forward as indenture labor through corridors I drew the maps for. I found out what I had built. I took what I could prove, and I took my daughter and I ran, and I have been running for 11 weeks. Sela sat pressed against my side on the floor by the cot, not touching her mother, not touching me exactly either, just close, radiating a stillness that had cost her everything she had to hold on to. Her freckle clusters had gone dark and stayed dark, no pulse of light at all, and I would learn that was the Dorith equivalent of held breath. They are that persistent, I said, 11 weeks. They are that persistent when the thing they lost is proof. Aviath's eyes found mine, and there was nothing performed in them, no plea calculated for effect, just a woman doing simple arithmetic out loud because she owed me the truth before I committed to anything. I am sorry. I did not choose this crossing because it was safe. I chose it because the maps I stole show this corridor as uncleared and impassable, which meant no patrol route runs through it. I gambled that whoever lived here, if anyone did, would not be Vantor. I did not gamble on kindness. I had none left to spend hoping for it. You gambled right either way, I said, and did not examine too closely why that was the thing I chose to say. That first night I gave them the cot and took the floor by the stove, and somewhere past midnight I woke, because the girl had crossed the room in complete silence and curled herself against my side like something homing in on a fixed point, and I lay very still and did not send her back, because some corrections a man makes and some he doesn't, and this one I didn't. Her mother, awake in the dark, watched this happen and said nothing for a long time. Then, quiet enough I almost missed it, "She has chosen you. Do you understand what that means among my people?" "No." "Then I will tell you, and you may decide afterward whether you want it understood or not. A breath. A Dorith child does not attach easily. We are raised to be careful with our trust. The debt registries taught us that lesson generations before I was born, and we have never fully unlearned it. When a child chooses an adult who is not blood, it is not affection. It is a decision, made with more clarity than we give children credit for, that this is the person who will keep them alive. She ran 300 meters through a tree line she did not know led to a killing field, toward a stranger, because some part of her had already decided you were the safer risk than staying with me another hour on that road. Her voice did not break, but it came close. She has chosen you as her dad. I am only telling you so that you understand what you agreed to the moment you carried her, instead of asking questions first. I did not have an answer for that. I have never been a man with much use for speeches, and I did not attempt to make one back at her. I only reached over, careful of the girl asleep between us, and set my hand flat against the floor, palm up, an offer, no more than that. Aviath looked at it for a long moment before she understood it wasn't nothing, and then she reached across her daughter and closed her hand around 2 of my fingers, and that was the whole of the agreement. Neither of us spoke again that night. Morning showed me things the dark hadn't. Sela's freckle clusters, I learned over that first breakfast, were not decoration and not quite emotion either. Aviath called them a reading, the way a person's color or breathing might be a reading, an involuntary broadcast of whatever state a Dorith body was actually in underneath whatever face it was making for the world. Sela's had stayed dark and shallow through that entire first meal, watching me over a bowl of porridge she ate without once looking away from my hands, and I understood without being told that she was still doing arithmetic of her own, testing whether the man who had carried her off dangerous ground the day before was a kindness that would hold or a kindness that had already spent itself. She tested it in small ways for the first 3 days. She would leave a cup half filled by my chair and watch from across the room, whether I moved it or ignored it or grew impatient with the mess. She would go quiet in a doorway in time, I think. How long it took me to notice, she'd stopped following and come back for her. She never once tested it the way another child might have, no tantrum, no crying jag to see what it would buy her. Because Aviath was right. The Dorith did not raise their children soft. And a child that careful had already learned that grief spent on the wrong audience only left you with less grief to spend later on someone who deserved it. By the fourth morning, the freckle clusters had started to pulse again when she looked at me, faint but steady, and Aviath, watching from the stove, said nothing. But I saw her shoulders come down half an inch, and I understood that had been its own kind of test, one I hadn't known I was taking. They stayed. There was no discussion of an alternative, not really. The resettlement roads south were exactly where a Vantor patrol would expect a fleeing woman to run, and the Kestrel line, half cleared and officially treacherous, was the one stretch of ground nobody sane would look for them on. I told the authority liaison in Aldwick Reach that I'd taken on a survey assistant and her daughter, paperwork nobody bothered to check twice, because nobody ever came out to Murren's Crossing to check anything twice. And for 6 weeks the lockhouse held 3 people instead of 1, and I relearned things about myself I had put away with the old uniform. Sella shadowed me. Not immediately. The first week she watched from the doorway, from the window, from behind her mother's leg, cataloging me the way you'd catalog a piece of ground you didn't trust yet. But children on a clearance line either learn the rules fast or they don't survive to learn them slow. And by the second week, she had attached herself to my morning circuit with a seriousness that would have been funny if the ground underneath us hadn't been real. I taught her the flags. I had not intended to. You do not teach a 6 or 7-year-old, whatever the Dorith equivalent came to read a minefield, and I said so to Aviath the first time I caught Sella crouched at the orange-white boundary studying it like a puzzle. Aviath only looked at me with an expression that had a lot of hard-won practicality in it. She is going to study it whether you teach her correctly or she teaches herself wrong, she said. Which do you prefer? So I taught her. Orange, safe, walked and probed and certified. White, probed once, holding, watch your feet but don't panic. Black, don't. I taught her the sweep pattern, the 2-meter discipline, why a flag moved by wind still counted as moved and needed resetting before anyone crossed near it. She absorbed it the way some children absorb a language, whole and fast and without visible effort. And within 3 weeks, she was walking 4 paces behind me on the orange lanes, with a seriousness that made the authority inspector, on his one visit that autumn, ask if I'd hired a very small and very solemn junior contractor. She did not talk much. When she did, it landed. The first time she spoke a full sentence of trade cant to me, she'd been learning it faster than I was learning Dorith. Children always do, was on a morning 3 weeks in, crouched beside me while I logged a cleared meter in the ledger, and what she said was, "You write the number even when nothing was there." Especially when nothing was there, I told her. That's how the next person knows this ground was checked, not skipped. She considered that with the full weight of a much older person, so the number means someone looked. Not that something was found. That's exactly what it means. She nodded once, filed it away, and from then on she wanted the ledger job herself, sounding out the digits with a fierce concentration that had nothing childish in it at all. And I let her, because a girl who understood the difference between checked and empty at that age had already understood something about the world that had cost her more than it should have. There was one morning, 5 weeks in, that tested every rule I'd taught her, and I have never stopped being grateful she'd learned them well enough to pass it. We were on the white lane, probed and holding ground, and my coil gave me a reading that didn't match the survey log, a strong ferrous mass, shallow, exactly where the log said there should be nothing at all. Sella was 4 paces behind me as always, and when I went still and raised one flat hand, the signal for hold, she held absolutely, both feet planted, not one muscle drifting toward curiosity the way a child's will. I worked the find for 20 minutes with my probe and my brushes while she stood in the cold, not moving, not speaking, her freckle clusters gone dark and steady with the particular stillness of a person doing the one useful thing available to her, which was staying exactly where she'd been told to stay. It turned out to be an old fuel drum, corroded through, buried by some long-forgotten quartermaster and never logged. Nothing. But when I finally straightened up and called the all-clear, she walked to me on legs that were shaking, and she did not cry, and she did not ask what it had been. She only said, "The number today is a longer number to write," meaning the ledger entry, meaning the 20 minutes of holding still had been its own kind of work worth recording, and I told her she was right, and I let her write it herself, in a hand that took longer than usual to steady. Some evenings after she'd gone down, Aviath and I talked about things that had nothing to do with the Vantor remnant at all, about the war on my side of it and the occupation years on hers, about what it meant to be two people trying to build something small and ordinary out of ground that recent history had spent itself trying to ruin. She had been a cartographer because her mother had been one, she told me, in a family line that went back to before the debt registries, back to when Dorothy maps had been drawn for the sake of knowing a place rather than for the sake of moving people through it against their will. "I want her to grow up drawing maps of places," she said one night, watching the stove fire, "not maps of escape routes. I do not know yet if that is a thing I can give her. I only know it is the thing I am trying to build toward." I did not have a tidy answer for that either, but I found myself, more than once that autumn, thinking that the willows I'd never gotten around to planting along the flood channel might be worth the effort after all, though I would not have been able to say yet exactly why. Aviath healed, the arm scarred but closed clean. She took over what she could of the lockhouse, meals, mending, the endless small maintenance a place like that demanded, with the brisk competence of a woman who had spent a career reading terrain from paper, and clearly found some grim comfort in reading it with her hands instead for a while. In the evenings after Sella slept, she and I would sit by the stove and she would tell me, in careful, controlled pieces, what she knew of the Vantor remnant's transit routes, their patrol discipline, their patience. Because they were patient, she said, more patient than anger usually allows a man to be, which was its own kind of warning. "They will not chase a rumor forever," she told me one night, "but they will chase proof for years. What I carried out is proof. Names. Route maps with my own hand on them, cross-referenced against registry numbers that were supposed to have been sealed. If it reaches the Reach Magistrate's circuit, it ends 3 trafficking corridors and several careers that thought themselves untouchable. They cannot let it reach that circuit. Which means they cannot simply give up on us. How close were they when you crossed here? 2 days behind when I picked this route. I do not know how close they are now." She looked at the dark window, at the black shape of the line beyond it. "I know they will eventually think to ask why a survey contractor at an uncleared crossing took on an assistant, and a child no one in Aldwych Reach can account for a history of. Small towns keep no secrets on purpose. They keep them by accident for a while, and then they don't." She was right, of course. It was 5 weeks and 4 days after that first frost morning that the accident of secrecy ran out. The man who came to the lockhouse called himself a supply inspector for the Reach Authority, and he had the paperwork for it, and the paperwork was good enough that I looked at it twice and still couldn't fault the print. But I had spent 3 years learning to read ground, and grounds don't lie the way people can be taught to. And this man's eyes did the thing that trained eyes do when they're cataloging a room instead of visiting one doorway's exits. Who else was present? Where the girl standing half behind the woman by the stove was standing in relation to both. I kept him on the porch. Told him supply audits happened by appointment through the authority office in Aldwych Reach, which was true, and that I hadn't had notice of one, which was also true, and watched him decide in real time whether pushing past that would cost him more than it gained. He asked, on his way to not pushing, A handful of questions that were almost good enough to pass for routine. How many personnel on site? Whether I'd taken on help for the season? Whether Aldwych Reach had seen any unregistered arrivals in recent months? That last one dropped in so casually between two boring lines about requisition forms that a less careful listener might have missed the seam. I gave him boring answers back, flat and unhelpful. The answers of a man who found supply audits tedious and had nothing to hide because he had nothing interesting going on at all. And I watched his eyes do the thing trained eyes do when a story is holding together, but the teller is trying too hard to make it sound like it isn't a story, which is its own kind of tell if you've spent enough years learning to read faces instead of ground. He didn't push. He left a card with a name on it that meant nothing and a number that would ring nowhere, and he walked back down the certified lane toward town at a pace that was careful never to look like he was hurrying. And I stood on that porch until he was well out of sight, and then went inside and told Avieth we had, at most, 3 days. She did not panic. I want that on the record because it would have been reasonable too. She sat very still for a moment, doing the same arithmetic I could see her doing that first night, and then she said, 3 days is enough time to be gone properly, or it is not enough time at all, and I would rather know which before it decides for us. You're not going to outrun a patrol on the resettlement road. Not with her, not on foot, not against men who have had 11 weeks of practice hunting exactly that. I know. Then we don't run on the road. I had spent 3 years refusing to certify 11 kilometers of ground I could have certified faster if I'd cut corners the way some contractors do, submitting probable clear as certified clear, and pocketing the difference in time as profit. I hadn't cut those corners, not once, and the reason wasn't virtue exactly. It was the same stubbornness that had gotten me discharged with opinions the old command hadn't wanted, the flat refusal to sign my name to a thing I hadn't personally verified. That refusal had cost me 3 years of slower pay. It was about to be the only asset I had. There was a second lane. I had never logged it with the authority, never flagged it in their system, because it wasn't finished. A narrow probed corridor along the river's old flood channel. 40 meters of ground I had cleared personally, alone on my own time, over the previous winter. For no reason I could have explained then, except that a man who reads ground for a living likes having one route nobody else knows exists. It ran from behind the lockhouse to a break in the old military perimeter, wire a kilometer downriver, well clear of both the official flagged lanes and the tree line where Sella had first come running. It was not on any map the authority held. It was not on any map Avieth had stolen, either, which meant it was not on any map the Vantor remnant could possibly be carrying. There's a way out they don't know about, I told Avieth. It's slow, it's narrow, but it's mine and nobody's walked it but me. And the flagged lanes. I'm going to make sure whoever comes looking finds those instead. I will not pretend the plan that followed was clever in the way stories like to make these things clever. It was not clever. It was patient, and it relied entirely on men who had spent 11 weeks hunting an unarmed woman, and a child assuming that the same would be true of whatever they found at the end of the chase. That speed and confidence would carry them the last 100 meters the way it had carried them the first 1,100 kilometers. On the second night, with a patrol confirmed moving up from Aldwych Reach on intelligence I have never asked how Avieth's ledger contacts obtained, I walked Avieth and Sella out along the unlogged river lane myself, in full dark, at a pace that cost my knees for a week afterward. The river lane was narrow enough that we had to walk it single file. My hand torch shielded to a sliver of red light I trusted only, because I'd walked that 40 meters 100 times in daylight and knew every stone in it by feel as much as sight. Avieth carried nothing but the folded proof sewn into the lining of her coat, and a small bag of what little she'd let herself accumulate in 6 weeks of trying not to accumulate anything. A life kept light on purpose by a woman who had learned the hard way what running with too much cost you. Sella walked between us without a sound, the way she'd learned to walk every flagged lane since the first week, placing her feet exactly where mine had gone. And somewhere in the middle of that crossing, I understood that the flag discipline I'd taught her for one kind of danger was the same discipline keeping her alive now for an entirely different one, and that she had learned it well enough to trust it completely, even here, even now, even frightened. Near the wire I crouched down to her height one last time, the way I had that first morning in the frost, and I told her, in the plain trade camp we'd built together, because I wanted no room for it to be misheard, that her mother would keep her safest for the next stretch, and that I would come after as soon as the ground let me. She studied my face for a long moment in the dark with an intensity that made me feel measured down to the bone, and then she reached out and pressed 2 fingers flat against the back of my hand, once, the way I'd seen Aviath do to me on that first night, and I understood it for what it was. Not a child's goodbye, but the same agreement being renewed on new ground. And I left them at the break in the wire with the coordinates of a reach magistrate's circuit rider Aviath trusted, and I told Sella to hold onto her mother's hand the whole way and not mine, this once, because this once I needed both my hands free. She looked at me in the dark with those gold eyes gone nearly black in the low light, and her freckle clusters pulsed once, slow, and she said, in trade camp she'd built herself out of 6 weeks of listening, "You are coming after." Not a question. I had learned by then that she rarely asked questions when she'd already worked out the shape of the answer. After I told her, "Go," I walked back alone, reset every flag I'd need reset, and I did the one dishonest thing I have ever done on that ground in 3 years of scrupulous certification. I moved the orange markers on the eastern shoulder lane 40 meters north of True, onto ground I had personally probed to a hard black rating in the spring survey and left seeded and undisturbed exactly, because it was too dangerous to touch without an extraction crew. I'd never been sent. I left the True certified lane dark and unmarked. I left a single lantern burning in the lockhouse window, the kind of light that says someone is home and hasn't heard you coming yet, and I sat on the porch in the cold with nothing in my hands but a hand torch and a voice, because I did not own a weapon that would have mattered against 4 trained men, and I had decided somewhere on that long walk back that I was not going to pretend otherwise. I want to be honest about the 2 hours I sat there waiting, because they were not brave hours and I have never told anyone they were. I was afraid in the specific, useless way. A man gets afraid when the only tool he has is patience, and the only plan he has depends entirely on someone else's arrogance holding steady long enough to matter. I thought more than once about walking down the lane myself and simply putting myself between them and the True crossing, and I talked myself out of it each time for the same reason. A body in the way is a delay, not a wall, and delay was not what Aviath and Sella needed from me that night. What they needed was for 4 confident men to keep believing, right up until it stopped mattering whether they believed anything at all, that the easiest ground was the ground closest to where a frightened contractor happened to be sitting. They came a little after 4 in the morning, 4 of them, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who believed the hardest part of the job was behind them. I let them get close enough to see me sitting there before I stood, and I told them once, in the flattest and most honest voice I had, that the ground they were standing on was not certified, that the flags they could see were not the flags they thought they were, and that I would say this exactly one time. The lead man laughed. I remember that clearly, not cruel, just genuinely amused, the laugh of a man who has heard a great many people try a great many angles to slow him down and finds this one unoriginal. He said something about contractors and their little kingdoms, and he told his men to move around me rather than through me, angling north along the shoulder toward ground he had every reason, from where he stood, to believe was the safest way past a man he'd already decided wasn't a threat. I had spent 3 years telling myself, and meaning it that I was not that man anymore, not the one who signed his name to consequences he'd rather not look at directly. I sat with that the whole hour I waited on the porch, turning it over the way you'd turn over a suspect reading, trying to find the seam in it, and I never did find one, because there wasn't one to find. I had offered the warning honestly. I had offered it exactly once, plainly, in a voice with nothing performed in it, to men who had spent 11 weeks proving they did not extend that same honesty to a woman and a child who had never raised a hand against them. What happened after that was not something I did to them. It was something the ground had always been going to do to anyone who walked onto it wrong, and my only choice, the only one that had ever really been mine to make, was whether I let it happen to people I loved or to men who had chosen, freely and more than once, to keep hunting them anyway. I am not proud of how easy that arithmetic turned out to be. I am not ashamed of it either. Both of those things are true at once, and I have made my peace with carrying them together. I am not going to describe what the ground did. I was not close enough to see much beyond light and sound, and what I did see I have no intention of carrying into anyone else's head the way it sits in mine. I will say only this. It was fast. It was contained to the ground they had chosen to walk on rather than the ground I was standing on, and when it was over the night was very quiet in the particular way that follows a sound like that, a quiet with a texture to it, and I sat back down on the porch step because my legs had stopped being reliable, and I did not move again until the sun came up gray over the line. The Reach authorities report, filed 6 weeks later after a survey team confirmed what remained of the eastern shoulder, called it Vantor remnant attrition on unmarked hazard ground, a known risk of the region, no further action indicated. The inspector who came to review my certification logs afterward was a different man than the one who'd worn the false credentials, an older authority surveyor named Torin who had walked enough contested ground himself to ask the right questions without ever quite asking the one that mattered. He looked at my log for a long while, at the true dates and the true readings I had never falsified even once in 3 years, and he looked out the window at the shoulder where the extraction crew was still working, and he said only that unmarked hazard ground did what unmarked hazard ground had always done, and that the authority was grateful I hadn't been standing closer. I let him believe I agreed with him about the luck of it. Nobody asked me why the markers had been 40 meters off that particular night. I did not volunteer it. There are certifications a man signs with his name and certifications he carries alone, and I have made my peace with which one that was. Obvious proof reached the magistrate's circuit inside the month. I heard, second-hand and much later, that it closed 2 transit corridors and ended the careers of several men who had believed a war's ending was the same thing as a debt's forgiveness, and that a handful of children traced through those registries were returned, late and imperfectly but returned, to families the war had scattered. Aviath read the notice of that last part standing in my doorway with the paper shaking very slightly in her hand, and she did not cry either, the same way her daughter hadn't, and I understood by then that this was simply how the two of them carried the heaviest things, upright and quiet, and that the not crying was its own kind of strength I had no business mistaking for coldness. She never told me the full shape of what it cost her to hand that proof over in the first place, the maps she'd drawn in good faith once, before she'd understood what they were for, and I never asked. Some ledgers a person keeps private, and I had learned by then to recognize the look of a woman closing one. She and Sella stayed in Aldwych Reach. Not at the lockhouse. Aviath took survey work with the resettlement office, cartography being exactly the skill the Reach authority was short of, and found rooms in town where Sella could be near other children learning a language that was becoming, slowly, as much hers as the one she'd been born to. It was not an easy settling in. The Reach was a town of refugees from 3 different sides of a war that had barely finished being over, and a green-skinned girl with gold eyes and pointed ears drew looks in the market that first year, some curious, some not kind at all, And there were afternoons Avieth walked home with her daughter's hand gripped tight, and her jaw set in the particular way I'd come to recognize as a woman refusing to let a bad hour become a bad life. Sella weathered it the way she weathered most things, with a stillness that looked older than she was, and slowly, the way these things go in small towns that have run out of the energy for grudges, the looks softened into something closer to ordinary. By the second spring she had 2 friends her own age who came out to Murren's Crossing on weekends to watch her write in the ledger like it was the most interesting thing in the Reach, which, to them, it apparently was. But the girl kept the ledger job. Every weekend she walked the 2 kilometers up to Murren's Crossing, alone by the second spring because she'd earned that much trust from her mother and from the ground both, and she wrote the cleared meters in the book in a hand that had gotten steadier every season, sounding out nothing now, just writing, the way you write a thing you've stopped having to think about. It was the spring after that, a year and a half from the frost morning she came running out of the tree line, that Avieth asked me, in the plain, unceremonious way she asked most things that mattered, whether I understood that among her people there was a naming that went with what Sella had already decided a year and a half before. Not a ceremony with witnesses and speeches. Dorith custom, she told me, ran quieter than that. A person planted something, together with the child, on ground that mattered to both of them, and the planting was the whole of the rite. And afterward the word for it changed from something a child had chosen alone to something the whole world was permitted to call true. We planted a line of river willows along the flood channel, along the lane I'd cleared alone, the one that had gotten them out, the 3 of us, in the last cold week before true spring. Avieth had chosen willows on purpose, she told me, because they were a tree that grew fastest on ground that had been disturbed, ground other things wouldn't take root in easily, and she wanted Sella to grow up walking past a living reminder that the worst ground could still be made to hold something on purpose. Sella's small hands packed dirt around roots with the same fierce concentration. She'd once given a ledger column, stopping every so often to press her palm flat against the cold earth the way I'd taught her to test a suspect reading, as if she were checking this ground too, one last time, for her own reasons. When the last one was in and tamped down, she straightened up, dirt on her knees, freckle clusters glowing steady and warm in the gray light, brighter than I had ever seen them, and she looked at me and said the word, the real word, in her own language this time, not the borrowed trade cant she'd used with me all along, and I did not need Avieth to translate it for me to understand exactly what it meant. Avieth said it too, quietly, a confirmation rather than a translation, and then the 3 of us stood there a while longer in the cold not saying anything else at all, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying. The Kestrel line is fully certified now, all 11 kilometers, the last of it closed out 2 winters ago. The willows along the flood channel are taller than Sella is. The corridor is quiet, not empty, quiet, and there is a difference, and she was the one who taught me to hear it, crouched beside me on cold mornings before she was old enough to know she was teaching anything at all. I still walk it most days, out of habit more than necessity now, and some mornings she walks it with me, taller each season, still placing her feet with the same old care out of habit rather than need, and neither of us says much, because we never needed to. Avieth draws real maps now, of orchards and irrigation lines and roads that lead nowhere more dangerous than a market, and some evenings she brings one out to the lockhouse to show me, spreading it flat on the table the way she once spread a stolen route map with her hand shaking, and I have watched her hand go steady over the years in a way that tells its own story better than she ever would out loud. The ground remembers what it costs to be safe. So do we. That's the whole of what I know how to say about it, and it has always been enough.